Hello and welcome to the International News Daily Podcast. I'm your host, Dennis Dunicic. Subscribe to our channel if you haven't already to stay in the loop on the most relevant global affairs. Now let's get right into our main story today, which concerns the Ethiopian civil war or the Tigray conflict, depending on who you ask. At that point, you're just playing semantics. Now, I am not going to go into the details and the history and the causation of the Tigray War or the Ethiopian civil war. We've actually covered this before. Roughly about a month ago, we went over the causation of the war, how the war is playing out, and how it could eventually end up. And if you're really interested, there's a lot of good stuff in that video. You can find it in our Africa playlist. Instead, today's report is concerning that specific conflict, but more specifically, it is concerning a United Nations investigation on human rights in the country. Now, ever since the conflict, allegations, reports to journalists, and a lot of claims of war crimes, human rights abuses, and a humanitarian crisis have gone on and occurred in Ethiopia, and more specifically, the Tigray region. Now, the United Nations, obviously because of international pressure and to ensure that human rights are not being abused on a major level, had to investigate and figure out what's going on. Now, this report was actually done as a joint investigation with the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, and that is problematic. The Ethiopian Human Rights Commission is a body of the government of Ethiopia, and the government of Ethiopia is one side of the conflict, okay? And the other side of the conflict are the Tigray forces or the Tigray region, and that's problematic. That would be like going into the former Yugoslavia and doing an investigation of war crimes with Slobodan Milosevic. It just is extremely problematic, and the EHRC, the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, caused a lot of problems for the UN investigation. And you have to keep in mind that during this entire conflict, both sides have been accused, and witness testimonies and victims and journalistic reports have shown that both sides have likely committed terrible crimes against humanity, and at the very least, widespread abuses of basic human and civil liberties. Now, obviously, when doing an investigation with a government force during the civil war, that report is going to be biased. But interestingly enough, the UN Human Rights Report actually stated the big amount of abuses are actually on the side of the Ethiopian government and the Eritrean nation, which is a neighboring country of Ethiopia that has allied itself with Ethiopian government forces. The vast majority of abuses that they have found have actually been carried out by the Ethiopian government and Eritrea, not by Tigray. But both sides have been carrying out these abuses. Now, keep in mind, this report that was done is fundamentally flawed. One, because as I just stated, it was done in a joint effort with the Ethiopian government, meaning obviously there's going to be a lot of bias and a lot of pressure to hide certain things from UN investigators. In addition to this, UN investigators did not have access and could not enter some of the worst hit regions during this war, particularly Aksum, which in Aksum, a widespread amount of abuses were alleged to have occurred. Now, finally, the report completely failed to achieve its one goal, which was to give a scope, a number, a general ballpark estimate of how many crimes are being committed, what kind of crimes are being committed, how often are these crimes being committed. These basic scopes, let's call them levers, were not established in this report. And the report really only just established and repeated what everyone has known for months. And in our last report on Ethiopia, we mentioned that there have been war crimes occurring on both sides and that the human rights crisis is major. Now, finally, the report failed to investigate one of the most major issues and most major human rights crisis, specific human rights crisis, that has occurred during this conflict. Now, at the beginning of this civil war, Tigray was very quickly overtaken by Ethiopian and Eritrean forces. However, Tigrayan forces would take back their capital city of Mekelle in the Tigray region and slowly, until June, take over their entire region, take back control of their region. And Tigrayan forces have grown so much in strength that they currently present a real threat of attacking and invading the Ethiopian capital of Addis Ababa. So the tide of the war has completely shifted. But what's important to note is during this period after June, when Tigrayan forces retook control of their region, Ethiopian forces and Eritrean forces created a blockade. And this blockade prevented the free flow of commercial goods and the entry of humanitarian aid. And before this blockade, while Ethiopian and Eritrean forces were retreating and being forced back by Tigrayan forces, they were burning crops, destroying goods, destroying shops, destroying food sources. And basically, what this meant is that this scorched earth campaign on top of a blockade meant that the Tigrayan region, for a good period of time, for many, many months, was starved out, deprived of food and basic necessities. This is considered the biggest human rights violation that has occurred during this conflict. Keep in mind that starvation as a weapon of warfare is an actual charge and a very major crime against humanity that can be tried in an international criminal court or tribunal. That is probably the most serious thing to investigate as of now, that the international community is aware of. And the UN could not come to a 100% conclusion whether or not this blockade deliberately was created to starve out the region of Tigray. It did starve out the region of Tigray. It did cause a human rights crisis, but they cannot establish whether or not this was deliberate. And, you know, this report fundamentally is flawed. It's not based off of forensic evidence. It's not based of physical evidence or data. It is based off of eyewitness and victim testimony. Specifically, 260 witnesses were interviewed and interrogated about what happened in this region. Now, that is actually a really small number. 260 might sound like a lot of people, but when you consider the fact that this conflict is occurring in a country of 110 million people, the word of 260 people is not enough to establish any kind of case to accuse any party concretely of violating any human rights or committing any forms of crimes. And the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, who, by the way, ironically, is a former winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. He's a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. Abiy Ahmed has stated that this investigation by the United Nations, which was done in conjunction with his government, more specifically the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, is flawed, that he feels there's a lot of allegations in there that are not based in fact. However, he also feels that it has exonerated some of the worst allegations against his government. And he stated that no one has committed genocide. Now, it's interesting. He actually said no one has committed genocide, but no one has accused him of committing genocide. That is not a concrete accusation in this report. And finally, he stated that this report is a time for Ethiopia to get better and police itself better and to take the perpetrators of any war crimes and bring them to justice. So, to kind of process everything he said, one, he said, we've done nothing wrong. Two, he said, it's proven that we've done nothing wrong. Three, he said, the accusations of him doing something wrong are wrong. And finally, he said, we might have done something wrong. If we did, we're going to police ourselves to make sure we don't do anything wrong in the future. The entire statement pretty much made no sense and was just contradiction after contradiction after contradiction. Now, the United Nations ended this report by recommending the international community to help and assist, support, that is the actual quote, support the Ethiopian government to bring a resolution to this conflict. And there has to be some kind of resolution here. This conflict is constantly changing sides. At the beginning of the conflict, within less than a month, Tigray was overwhelmed by Ethiopian forces, and the capital of Tigray was overtaken by Ethiopian forces. Mekelle was overtaken. Not long after, Tigrayan forces would recuperate, retake Mekelle, retake the region, and now, right now, today as we speak, and we're talking about a matter of days, Tigrayan forces are presenting a very real threat of attacking the Ethiopian capital city of Addis Ababa. This conflict is extremely difficult to predict, and that actually gives you context as to why the United Nations did not want to really take a side in its report, because they don't even know who's going to win this conflict. At the end of the day, this is a civil war, and there is eventually going to be a winner. How long it's going to take, no one knows. But what has been established is that since day one of this war, human rights violations have been occurring. Now, there is still no forensic or physical evidence, but an entire year of journalistic investigations, non-governmental observers, and now finally the United Nations stating that most likely war crimes and crimes against humanity are being committed on both sides only mean that as this conflict continues, the situation for innocent people, civilians, only gets worse. And finally, the UN ended by stating that recently the conflict has began to have an alarming ethnic tone to it. Now, this conflict began as a political one, but it is slowly being turned into a major ethnic conflict. And that is problematic. Ethnic conflicts can get extremely dirty. And that's where the vast majority of crimes against humanity in our world and modern history occur in today. I would try and predict the situation and tell you how things are going to end up. I don't know. This conflict is actually very difficult to predict. It's even-ended. Either side could come out as victorious. But the reality is the conflict is probably going to be stretched out, and it's going to take a very long time before it's resolved. The international community is probably not going to become directly involved because no one wants to pick sides at this point. But what is clear is there is a humanitarian crisis. And the longer this war carries out, the longer the crisis carries out. So I'm not going to end today with an analysis or a prediction. Today was just a basic report. But let me know what you think about the conflict. Let me know how you think things could potentially end, how things can turn out, and how bad you truly think the conflict is. And finally, do you think that the international community is doing enough? See you next time.